G'day YouTube, Warbles on a lot here. We're about to have a little bit of insight showered onto us regarding how come Australia has become, in the past 30 years, a raging example of a prison state, courtesy of the ABC Radio National.
Is Australia at locking people up? This country's imprisonment rate is just above the OECD average, but between 2003 and 2018, the only countries that experienced faster growth in imprisonment are Turkey and Colombia. The imprisonment rate growth in Australia is up about 25%, even though the crime rate went down 18% over the last decade. The Productivity Commission has looked into this conundrum in a new research report called Australia's Prison Dilemma. So to talk us through the hard labour of the Productivity Commission on the issue of Australia's concerning imprisonment rate, we now welcome to Radio National Commissioner Stephen King. Stephen is also Adjunct Professor of Economics and a former Dean at the Monash University in Melbourne. Stephen King, this is the Productivity Commission's first venture into research on the criminal justice system. Why did the Commission take up this topic?
The Productivity Commission's been doing more work in the human services area, broadly speaking, mental health, acute health care, issues of public housing in recent years. One area we hadn't looked at was the criminal justice system. And when we looked into that system, the startling fact that you've already mentioned, the fact that we have more and more people in prison, and we have had since the mid-1980s, whilst at the same time, the number of offenders is going down. And so that fact just sits there and you have to ask why.
It really is a startling fact and surprising. It's not something that was on my radar. Imprisonment rates up, crime rates falling. Could you sort of unpack those two phenomena for us a little bit? And in particular, why don't you think that the increase in incarceration rates is the cause of the lower crime rates?
There's been quite a bit of work done both here in Australia and overseas asking, well, does locking people up for longer, does increasing the chance of ending up in prison have a significant effect on crime rates? And unfortunately, the answer is no. The causes of crime are complex. They often go back to social conditions, but locking people up for longer isn't the reason why crime has gone down, which means that we have to start looking at, well, why is this occurring? And the big factors that we found were what we'll call tough on crime policies.
One of the factors that really struck me in terms of analysing the population within Australian prisons is the increasing rate of remands. And I suppose that's related to those tough on crime policies. Could you tell us about the remand rate and your broader thoughts on the impact of policy on imprisonment rates in this country?
So when we're looking at that increase over the last 15 years that you mentioned at the beginning, 64% of that is due to an increase in the number of people on remand. They're people essentially awaiting their day in court, awaiting their trial, or awaiting sentencing. So there's been a significant factor, and that is straight out driven by tough on bail laws. The New South Wales and Victoria, for example, for a range of crimes, the onus of proof or the burden of proof is being reversed. So instead of the assumption being, well, until you're found guilty, you'll be allowed out on bail unless it's shown that you're unsafe to the community, the reverse has been applied. So unless you can prove you should be getting bail for some reason, we're going to lock you up, even though you're still awaiting essentially a guilty verdict.
You mentioned New South Wales there. I'd be interested to know also, obviously prisons are the responsibility of the states in Australia. Are there particular jurisdictions that are driving this concerning national picture that you've highlighted?
So the imprisonment rates differ quite a bit across Australian jurisdictions. Anyone who has a read of our report will come across some graphs where the Northern Territory has to have its own numbers put next to it because it has an imprisonment rate that is more than double the next state being Western Australia. And Western Australia is 50% higher than New South Wales, Queensland and so on. So we have these big differences across Australia, but the trend that we've seen, this increasing imprisonment rate, is right across the country. This has been in every jurisdiction. So it's not just driven by one or two states.
And there have been changes in the level and the mix of crime that is leading to imprisonment. Is that right?
Yeah, there's been a change in composition of crime. That has differed between some states. One of the reasons why there might be more people in prison is if individuals are committing more serious crimes, so they're locked up for longer, essentially. Over time, that's going to lead to an increased imprisonment rate. With the exception, potentially, of Victoria, that's not the driver. So in Victoria, one of that offender composition, that moved towards a mix of more violent crime and less non-violent crime, that does seem to matter, but it doesn't explain it for the rest of Australia.
It's really interesting. On Radio National, we're speaking with Productivity Commissioner Stephen King about the new research report released by the Productivity Commission called Australia's Prison Dilemma. Stephen, what does it cost to keep offenders in prison in Australia? And I wonder if you could also sort of tell us why you think the economic analysis is a good way to look at the criminal justice system and its effectiveness.
Okay, so what's it cost? A lot, around $5.2 billion per year, or $120,000 per year per prisoner. Just to give you a bit of a feel for what this increase is costing us, if we'd kept the imprisonment rate constant for the last 20 years, in the sense that as crimes changed, we locked people up as we did 20 years ago, the saving today would have been $13.5 billion, which is a huge amount of money. Now, why do we care about that? A legitimate question is to say, well, hang on, we've got to keep society safe. This is a cost we just have to bear. And our research shows that that's wrong. That whilst there are certainly individuals, there's certainly people who we need to have in prison to keep society safe, a significant number of people are in prison for minor offences, often with prison sentences of less than 6 months, sometimes less than 3 months. People cycling in and out of prison. And there are alternatives that have been tried, some in Australia, some overseas, which not only are cheaper, but they lead to better outcomes in the sense that, unlike prison, 60% of people who are in prison today have been there before, many for 4, 5, 6 times before. So our prisons are looking a bit like a treadmill. There are alternatives that help get individuals off that treadmill, so they're cheaper, they keep society safe, and they keep society safe in the short term and in the long term by reducing the likelihood that the individuals will commit crime in the future.
What are those cost-effective alternatives?
Yeah, so some of them, we've all become a bit too used to home detention around Australia.
Yes, that's right.
Time. One of them that has been trialled and found successful, and work's been done on this in South Australia and in New South Wales, is home detention with electronic monitoring, often connected in with programs. So many of the people that we're talking about here, the low-risk individuals, many of them have, for example, untreated, undiagnosed mental health issues. So incorporating programs for mental health treatment in with that home detention, that's been shown to be very effective, not only in detaining the individuals whilst they're under detention, but also in reducing their likelihood of committing future crime. Another one that's been done in the ACT is what's called through care. About 5% of people going into prison are homeless when they go into prison. They're sleeping rough or they're couch surfing. Releasing those individuals 3, 4 months later from prison, they just go back to sleeping on the street, and it's not surprising. They have no job prospects, and they commit another minor property offence. They may have untreated drug and alcohol issues. So the through care model in the ACT says, when we release people from prison, let's give them the support they need so they can rebuild their life, find a job, and instead of costing taxpayers by another stint in prison, become taxpayers themselves.
It really is fascinating research. One of the things that surprised me reading the report is that you highlight the significant evidence gaps in assessing the Australian prison system. I would have thought it had been studied in great detail. What are those evidence gaps and how do we fix them?
Yeah, so there is Within criminal justice, there is simply a lack of communication across different parts of the system. So the policing part of the system, the courts and the prison system. So often the way they collect data and report data is completely inconsistent. So you actually cannot track an individual from arrest, court, prison, release, arrest, and so on. So you can't follow that lifetime, which makes it very difficult to work out, well, what's actually working in this space. There is work being done by the Australian Bureau of Statistics to try and start linking these data sets. But until we get the data sets on the prisoner life cycle, for want of a better term, that sounds like a bit of an economic term, it's very hard to analyse the system. The other big data gap is that both here and overseas, we try alternatives to prison, but we very rarely check if they're working. So we were able to highlight, I think it's about 19 case studies from around the world, but we were sort of scratching to find some of those, to find properly evidence-based evaluations. I recently heard a criminologist in the United States saying that 99% of their programs that they introduce, they're introduced, but a few years later they're defunded. No one knows if they worked, no one knows if they were beneficial or not. And the same situation happens here in Australia.
Well, that obviously needs to be addressed. Stephen King, is that the end of the line for the Productivity Commission work on the prison dilemma, or will there be more inquiry from your organisation?
But there are just a huge number of important issues in the prison space. Some of those we know very well, and some others looked at. For example, why 3% of the population, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, why the 3% of the population make up almost 30% of the prison population. That's something others have looked at, but it's something we need to keep on thinking about. The relationship between mental illness and prisons. Female prisoners is one of the fastest rising group. Almost 2/3 of women who are in prison have diagnosed mental health issues. So instead of treating the mental health issues, we're putting people in prison. So there's a range of issues there, and the Productivity Commission would love to look at some more of those in the future.
Well, thanks very much for joining us and explaining some of those fascinating details of Australia's prison dilemma. Stephen King.
Thank you, Julian.
Stephen King is Commissioner with the Australian Productivity Commission and Adjunct Professor of Economics at Monash University, and also a former Dean. And the Productivity Commission's research report is called Australia's Prison Dilemma. I'm Julian Morrow. Thanks for listening.
So there you go. And now you know. Everybody who thinks of Australia as being a great, wonderful, free nation built by the convicts shipped out from England 250 years ago. No, they've only got half of that story right. Australia is a fascist dictatorship prison state built by the prison guards who came out from England and fucking stayed here. That's how Australia began, with British Royal Naval Marines and redcoats guarding prisoners who were forced to work at gunpoint to construct the fantasies of the British Colonial Office in London. We were doing pretty well after the gold rush. I mean, assuming you're not an Aborigine, we were doing pretty well. After the gold rush, the egalitarianism, calling everybody digger, dig for gold, dig for gold, dig for gold. We claimed to have become a nation during the Boer War, although we also claimed to become a bloody nation when we sent troops to the Sudan, the siege of Khartoum, 2 opium wars and the Boxer Rebellion. We become a great bloody nation many times. Then we become a great nation when we invaded Turkey in the First World War in 1915. Yeah, once again, digger. All them diggers digging into the cliff in the Dardanelles before running up the cliff into machine gun and rifle fire. Great nation, the diggers of Australia. Very egalitarian. The only Australian government who's ever had the guts to put the army into strike breaking have been Labor governments. The Tory governments didn't actually have the effrontery or the daring or the connection with the electorate to try to do that. Ben Chifley, the steam train driver, he was the bloke who put the army in to the coal mines to break a miners' strike in the 1950s. Following the Korean War, we had the Vietnam War, and the population pretty much began to rise up and protest in the streets. I was only a kid at the time, but I remember it, you know. Australia was looking like a pretty progressive style of a country. And then we had the Whitlam dismissal. Some people say it was a CIA arranged coup. Other people say it emerged from Great Britain. The Deputy Under Royal Secretary to the Queen or something. I don't know. I was a teenager at boarding school. But while I was a teenager at boarding school, I met a bloke by the name of Demont. And Demont had been adopted by a family, and the family had split, and he was still being raised by his adopted father, and his adopted father threw a lot of money at the project and sent him to boarding school. But at the end of year 10, Demont left school, and he was a scattered sort of an individual. And while I was in year 11, Demont come up with a project where he wanted his adopted father to buy him a motor car. He was too young to have a licence, but he wanted his friends who had licences to drive him around the Sydney suburbs, having a great time, spending the stepfather's money. And when stepfather said no, Demont decided what he was going to do was wait till the old man was asleep in the upstairs bedroom of the fairly large palatial house that they lived in. And then he threw accelerant around the ground floor, and I think he locked a door or two, and he set fire to the place, and he was standing in the front yard watching the house burn and complaining that the neighbours were trying to put the fire out with their garden hoses while they called the fire brigade, who actually extinguished the fire. And it transpired that his plan was to burn his adopted father, and then he could inherit everything, and then he could buy the car for his mates to drive him around in. Like I said, a scattered, shattered individual, probably kind of typical of 20 or 30% of those who go to private boarding schools, sent there because their families can't be bothered with the difficulties of raising a teenager. Anyway, he went through the court process, and then when I was in year 12, news percolated through that he was in Berrima Jail. Not the Berrima Jail that still exists in Darwin, Berrima Jail that's in Burradoo. No, not Burradoo. Probably Berrima. Hey, how would that be? Forgive that little brain fart. So in year 12, we were allowed out on Saturday afternoons, Sunday afternoons, and when some of the day students got their licences, some of them began taking carloads of boarders like myself out to the Berrima pub. And the Berrima pub's next door to the Berrima jail. And after a couple of beers, 3 or 4 of us got the idea that it might be a funny idea on a Sunday afternoon to wander up to the jail and knock on the door and ask if we could visit young Mr. Demont. And we carried out that plan, and the guards at the front gate, it wasn't a particular visiting day or anything, but they decided it might be a good idea for a bunch of high school boys to see what the inside of a jail was like. So they let us in, put us in a waiting room. And I mean, the jail was built in like the 1830s or 1850s or something like that. The giant basalt stone blocks, freezing cold, even though it was spring. And yeah, down come Demont and told us what it was like. And basically, he had a better time in jail in the 1970s than we were having at boarding school. You know, we had to get permission to go to town once a week. He was allowed into town, I think it was Saturday mornings, to play cricket with the jail's cricket team against the local yokels on the village green. We had to run the gauntlet of priests with infrared binoculars to catch us smoking cigarettes on the other side of the trees at night time by the glow in the binoculars. Demont he got a full-ounce packet of drum and a couple of packets of cigarette papers and matches to smoke in his cell every week. He had a tobacco ration. So life in the Australian jails in the 1970s, from what I saw of it, that little tiny snapshot, it was kind of designed to make people stop and sit and think about what they'd done wrong and not brutalise them any further, not overcrowd them, not dehumanise them, and hopefully, I mean, there was an awful lot of education programs and rehabilitation programs were going on, set up by the Whitlam government and not yet dismantled by the succeeding Fraser government, which had percolated down to the state level, because I know I've just tagged federal politicians with what I saw on a state level. But anyway, that's what I sort of thought the prison system was supposed to be doing. I did have a few encounters with the gendarmerie, and I discovered that when there's cops and guns involved, the only correct manoeuvre is to put your hands in the air and say, "Sir, yes, sir." And I've watched over the years as the Australian society has changed, and in my observations, the biggest, ugliest, nastiest change happened when Nelson Mandela was let out of jail. And suddenly, about the same time as Australia got John Howard as the Prime Minister, and to grow the economy, it had been decided we needed to have more migrants. Johnny Howard came up with what he labelled the busyness migration scheme, which meant that anybody who could lay their hands on $1 million and point to a bank account that showed it, they could come to Australia. Everybody else with less than $1 million, they run the risk of being locked up on Nauru or Manus Island or Christmas Island or the other Christmas Island, or put in a detention centre and treated like shit forever, because Johnny Howard only wanted cashed up rich migrants coming to Australia. Now, when Nelson Mandela was in jail, you could tell a good South African, because they didn't live in South Africa. They'd abandoned all of their money and they'd gone somewhere else in the world to live, because they didn't want to live in a race-based slave economy. And if that meant being a poor person somewhere else in the world, that was a good deal for them. I did meet one good white South African who succeeded in getting his money out of the country. He was a South African Jew who spent World War II in prisoner of war camp because he got picked up at Dunkirk. And that must have been a pretty nerve-wracking 5 years or so, waiting for the Allies to win and hoping that Hitler didn't notice he was a Jew. But anyway, he went back to White South Africa and he lived under the apartheid regime. And I don't know whether he liked it or didn't like it, or compared it to Nazi Germany, his experience thereof, or what. But the point is, while Nelson Mandela was still in jail, this bloke decided to build himself in his backyard. Like I said, he was an engineer. He decided to build himself in his backyard a sailing boat, a sort of a cabin cruiser, Bermuda rigged, and he built it out of ferro concrete. Spent all of his life savings building the damn thing, and then he put it on a trailer and he took it to the nearest water side, launched it into a river or a bay or a harbour or some bloody thing. It's a long time since I talked to him. And once he got the hull floating, he then spent the last of his money setting it up so you could camp in the empty hull. And him and his missus went and camped in the empty hull, and then he sold his house, and he used the money from the house to finish fitting out his hull so she'd become an ocean-going sailing boat. And he stocked it with provisions, and he said to the de Klerk apartheid government, "Tally-ho, chaps, I'm going for a bit of a sailing test, see how this thing works. You know, I've built my boat, you know, I'm going to go backwards and forwards and do some figure eights in the ocean." And they said, "Good luck, mate." And he turned up in Western Australia and bought some new provisions, and turned up in South Australia and bought some new provisions, and turned up in Melbourne and got a new jug of water, turned up in Sydney, put the bloody boat up for sale. I don't know whether he asked for political asylum or what, but anyway, we said, "Yeah, sure, you're a bloody white man, you can come here." That's how we were. That's how our current government still is. You're a white man, you can stay here. And he bought a bus and he drove around Australia and New South Wales anyway, found a spot in Ward Crescent in Glen Innes in New South Wales. And he spent the money from the boat, which had been the money from his house in White South Africa, and he built himself a house in Glen Innes. clever man. And then they let Nelson Mandela out of jail, and it was all like, shit, you did a lot of work, when you could have just waited. Because after that, everybody in White South Africa who didn't want to live in a free and democratic White South Africa, they were permitted to take their money. And as Nelson Mandela said, you don't want to live here, take your money and piss off, go away. We don't want you here with your stupid bloody racist ideas. Well, a hell of a lot of them fetched up on the west coast of Australia, and they're still stuck in ghettos in the suburbs of Perth. Is they got here and they found they're not allowed to run around carrying guns. And they're terrified of what might happen to them if some of the things that they've done over there catch up with them here. So rather than live anywhere else in Australia, the very worst of them are behind barbed wire with private security guards in gated communities in the suburbs of Perth. That's where the worst of them are. But the ones who could get past the idea that Australia is a country where people are brave enough to walk around without carrying death machines for selfish defence against all their own persecutory fantasies, most of them come and tried to get a job either in the police, the private security industry, or increasingly, the bloody prison industry. You have a listen to the New South Wales Commissioner for Prisons, and he's got a Wenwi accent. Sure, you've heard the word Wenwi? When we were in Rhodesia, when we were on the Cape, when we were still in Joburg. Yeah, Wenwis. When we could get servants, when you could beat the boys and rape the girls and not have any bloody consequences to worry about. The Wenwis. And let's face it, the man said it, the Commissioner for Productivity, he said the figures. $120,000 a year the government spends to keep an Australian in jail. Where does that money go? The great bulk of it goes to the wages paid to the bloody prison guards. A heap more of it goes to the police who do prisoner escorts. A different pot of money actually goes to the police to pay them to catch these miscreants, malefactors, people who are involved in malevolence, which is male violence in which I do not appear. So you put them in jail and $120,000 a year gets basically given to the people who lock them up. The people who supply the jail with laundry services if they don't do it themselves, with food if they don't grow it themselves. Once upon a time they used to do a lot of this stuff in the jail, but it's much more efficient to source it through private enterprise. You see, that way the Liberal Party's cashed up mates get to make money out of the prisoners. And effectively, the equation is that $45 a day is all a dole bludger gets on unemployment benefits, New Start as they call it. But if you put them in jail, the prison guards get $250 a day or $500 a day or some ridiculous bloody figure to keep them locked up. And then they come into the main street and they spend their $450 a day in the main street, which is 10 times more productive than the poor bloody dole bludger with a joint in his sock could ever have been. So therefore, thus and because, we get all these marvellous schemes for keeping people out of jail, and a bit of money gets thrown at them for a year or two, and then as soon as it can be quietly defunded and never studied and never evaluated, it gets shit-canned so that the fucking prison warders who've been running Australia for 250 years can stay in a job. That's really all that's going on. And when you consider that, depending on how you define it, 65 to 85% of everybody who's in prison is in there for, quote, drug-related activities. And when you consider the suicide death rate and the accidental drug death rate of people who have allegedly survived, I'll put the allegedly in highlights and the survived in air quotes, inverted commas, who've allegedly survived having been sexually assaulted as a child, you begin to wonder this correlation. 48 times the death rate from accidental drug overdose, 18 times the death rate from suicide. The people who are in jail for drug-related activities, they've been chasing pain relief to try and cope with the shitty childhood that they had. So all of those fucking prison guards standing in neat straight rows, priding themselves on how crisp the seam in their trousers is and how shiny their little boots are. They are professionally demonising the victims of last generation's parental failures. That's who they are farming in their fucking concentration camps. And who have we got making the rules in Australia? A time-expired pink pig in a blue suit called Peter Dutton, who was in the Queensland Police back in the days when Queensland had the highest deaths in custody rate of any nation in the British Commonwealth. So what chance do you think there is of anything changing for the better here in Australia? I would suggest that as long as the refined transport fuel continues to arrive, there's no fucking chance of anything changing. As soon as there's no more refined transport fuel, then there's no diesel. When there's no diesel, there's no coal train, there's no bulldozer to push the coal from the train into the power station. If there's no coal going into the power station, then 54% of Australia's grid, which is coal-fired, falls on its arse and stops. 20% of the grid is gas-fired, but the entire grid has its sine waves synchronised by the mechanical operation of the coal-fired steam-powered stations. Change the angle of the dangle on the blades, the stator blades, between the rotors in the steam power turbine, and you can change the amount of torque coming out of it moment to moment to moment to moment, so that you can exactly match the torque going into the generator. Therefore, you match the generator's output with the load on the grid from all the customers and consumers flicking their light switches on and off and turning their hairdryers on at the same time every morning. If you haven't got a coal-fired power station, then you can't synchronise the grid. I mean, you probably could do it with gas turbines, but it's not set up that way. The infrastructure is built for coal-fired synchronisation. Once you've got no coal-fired synchronisation, then everybody with a solar panel on the roof and a grid-tied inverter to feed the 26% of the rest of the power into the system, sorry, there's no sine wave, no synchronised sine waves for the grid tie inverters to synchronise themselves with. So you can't run your grid on windmills and LP gas. You've got to have the coal there, and if you've got no diesel, you can't have the coal because no bulldozer and no coal train. And once you've got no grid, then you've got no way for the service station's cash register's computer to tell the electric pump in the Bowser to fill up the police car. And once you've got no fuel in the police car, then the gendarmerie are going to be on foot. The police paddock has been turned into a hockey field in Glen Innes 20, 30 years ago. The police don't have the facility or the ability to stable horses. And most of them can't friggin' ride a horse anyway. And without diesel to run the trucks full of bloody hay and grain and lucerne, nobody can feed a horse in Australia. So sometime after the fossil fuel runs out, then Australia's top-down authoritarian police state is going to just disintegrate. It will become effectively unpoliceable. Presumably, they will let the bloody prisoners out of the jails because their other alternative is to leave them locked up and let them starve to death, because there'll be no food trucks going out there. No diesel, remember? No diesel for the tractor to grow the food, or for the truck to cart it, or for the refrigerated storage. We stand on the cusp of a great paradigm shift here in Australia. We've got this marvellous, shiny, terribly fragile veneer of civilization that makes people want to clap and cheer and wave their flags and blow their bugles and tell their children what a fucking great job they've done of building a country. And it's all bullshit. It's all fucking bullshit. Just like that fella from the Productivity Commission explained. The rate of incarceration has gone up by 25%. The crime rate has dropped by 18%. And still, our right-wing neo-fascist shock jocks in the media and the greasy, sleazy politicians in the major parties, they are still getting elected on campaigns promising to be tough on law and order. Oh, we'll draw up a new law every time somebody does something stupid. Drunk driver hits a car, pregnant woman miscarries, loses a baby. Let's draw up a new law and call it Zoe's Law. Because in a country where abortion is legal and funded by Medicare, somehow a fetus is a more privileged life form than everybody else who has to share the roads with the bloody drunk drivers. And drunk driving, it's not like it was legal anyway. And it's not like the drunk driver who crashes into a car that happens to carry a pregnant woman who happens to lose the fetus. It's not like when they got in the car to drive drunk, they were planning to do that. It's not as if there's any actual causal connection between applying a harsher penalty to some particular crimes, because you can cause moral outrage in the suburbs when you do it on TV, and the incidence of people breaking the law. Because here's a red hot tip for you. At the moment that any individual human chooses to break a, quote, law, they are 100% certain that that law doesn't apply to them. Either they calculate that they personally are within their rights because you can't call my mother a whore, I'll come over and punch your head in. Yeah, well, actually, at law, nobody can make any noise with their mouth that justifies you assaulting them. It doesn't matter what they said about your mother, your daughter, your sister, your grandmother, your family fortune, the size of your dick, how fast your car is, how much money you owe on your house, or how fucking unemployable you are. No noise anybody makes with their mouth justifies you taking any violent action towards them. But you try and tell that to somebody who's in court trying to explain to the magistrate why they punched someone in a pub when they had too much beer on board. At the moment they threw the punch, they were completely convinced they were within their rights. When domestic violence incidents occur, whether it's a man beating up the wife or whether it's the wife trying to kill the husband, put a booby trap in his gas stove, put a booby trap in his electric drill, walk around the house in the middle of the night with a fucking carving knife, and then you'll just tell the police that you dreamed you were being raped by a Hell's Angel and you got the carving knife to deal with the Hell's Angel. Whoops, I killed hubby. When they commit the crime, they are convinced that they are perfectly within their rights so to do. The other side of that equation is the people who think they're so incredibly fucking smart. They've watched all the James Bond films. They can come up with a plan to commit a crime that nobody will ever catch them for. So therefore the law doesn't apply to them. Thus and because every well-intentioned attempt to draw up strict, harsh new laws in order to safeguard civilization, it's doomed. It never actually influences anybody who's in the process of deciding to commit a crime. They don't think it applies to them, or they think they're justified, or they think they're not going to get caught. The police and the courts exist to act on complaints from the public. Somebody does something that upsets you, you're supposed to go to the police, lodge a complaint. If the police can get enough information from that complaint to decide it's a reasonable sounding complaint, they then take action to the point of going out, tracking down the person you're complaining about, questioning them, perhaps arresting them. If they arrest them, then they just process the paperwork and send the whole lot off to the court. At the court, you either get summary justice from the magistrate on the bench, or you can be promoted to a jury trial at the district court. Major difference between the district court and the magistrate's court is how long the person sitting on the bench can sentence you to go to jail. I think it might be maximum 10 years for a magistrate. Perhaps it's 5. I honestly don't know. Perhaps it's a maximum of 15 years at the district court. The Supreme Court, that's where you go if you're facing a 20 or 25 year or a life sentence, the graduated response model. But what actually happens is the young individual, maybe not so young if they've decided to become a criminal later in life, they're bouncing around thinking that the world's their oyster. They can do whatever they feel like doing. They feel like doing a few things that people complain about. All of a sudden, up comes PC Plod, and PC Plod is equipped with a taser and capsicane and a 16-shot semi-automatic firearm with 2 spare clips of ammunition. Now, when I was a kid, I was told by the policeman that he was not issued his pistol in order to enforce the law. He was issued his pistol in order to defend himself if anybody else was silly enough to shoot at a policeman. Under the influence of a 50-year bombardment of American culture and media, a lot of people don't understumble that these days. There are police who'll pull out a gun and shoot some idiot for waving a knife on the other side of the yard. One bloke got shot for standing in the surf with the Pacific Ocean at his back, 5 cops in a semicircle around him. A couple of the cops were high on cocaine. Somebody accidentally pulled the trigger and the whole bloody lot shot him. Bang, 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 bang. So it can be a dangerous game getting picked up by the police, because you never know how advanced the fantasy of the policeman is or what drugs they're under. But according to LAW and LORE, according to law, you are supposed to be taken to court, where the prosecutor, paid by the police, puts the police case in the most convincing manner possible to the magistrate, the judge, the justice, the person who represents society at large. The jury perhaps decides on guilt or innocence. The magistrate, judge or justice decides on what sort of sentence one gets. But it doesn't all happen on one day. You get arrested, you got to go to court. Well, if you get bailed, you got to go to court at the next sitting date for a mention hearing. And then you got to come back for another mention hearing in about 3 months' time. And then come back for another mention hearing to make sure that everything is actually, the paperwork's occurring, the I's are being dotted, the T's are being crossed. And then you come back for a hearing of evidence. And then you'll get to come back another time for sentencing. And between being found guilty and being sentenced, if you are likely to go to jail, there will be a pre-sentence report ordered by the court from the Parole and Probation Service. It's a long, slow, grueling, anxiety-producing process. And if your parents have failed to teach you to toe the line and behave, and you start running off the rails when you're a teenager, you will go through that process 3 to 5 times, assuming you've got a learning curve, before you wake up to yourself and come to the conclusion that really the only way to stop society from interfering with your life in this way is not to give the bastards any excuse. And then bingo, voila, you have become a compliant citizen. You are complying with the laws. You are no longer running around in selfish mode, treading all over everybody else's rights. That's how the system's supposed to work. Enter the shock jocks. Enter the little old ladies with purple hairdos, the ones who live in the suburbs, the ones who believe that they should be able to make a complaint, tell the policeman what they think the nasty little buggers have done, and then the policeman should be able to go out and shoot the prick in the street as soon as they catch him. And if that's considered to be too draconian, maybe not shoot him, just take him and put him in jail forever. You know, they upset a little old lady with purple hairdo. And when that doesn't occur, when somebody goes to court and they get let out on bail because they have not been proved to be guilty, all of a sudden a little old lady with a purple hairdo rings up the radio shock jock who decides that he can make 500,000 people out of a city of 4 million. 500,000 people will listen to him and become absolutely outraged, and they'll yell at their radio and they'll stay listening, hanging off their shock jock's every word, and that way the shock jock will be able to sell more advertising into their radio program. So the tub gets beaten, and then along comes some pathetic political wannabe who hopes to get themselves elected, and they try to harness that engineered discontent that the shock jocks have built out of the little old lady with purple hairdo's ignorance and stumbling of how the system is supposed to work. As a result, crime drops, but the prisons are overflowing. You send a kid to prison when they're 15 rather than giving them bail. They go in there and they learn to really fucking hate society. You've given them something to cry for. And who's happy about it? Well, the police are happy. They get to be kept in a job. They claim not to like their job, but they turn up to get paid. The prison guards, the turnkeys, the warders, the screws, yeah, they fucking love it. They don't. Long as you get a constant stream of prisoners coming into the prison so that they can brutalise them, demonise them, spit them out with no resources and no support mechanisms and no job, so that they'll be more or less forced back to a life of crime so that they can be recycled through the front door. Yeah, the prison warders are fucking happy. There are people who make their whole career out of that shit. What have you done with your life, says St. Peter at the pearly gates. Oh, I locked up criminals for, 45 years. Yeah, right. Why did you do that? I was acting under orders. Yeah, that's what they said at Nuremberg too, didn't they? What did Jesus have to say about prison warders and guards? I don't remember hearing anything. 6 years at a Catholic boarding school, I don't remember Jesus ever saying that a prison guard was a good bloke. Funny that. Anyway, that's where it's at. I blame the bastards who let Nelson Mandela out of jail. If they kept him in jail, then all those fucking white South African authoritarian neo-Nazi arseholes would have stayed there. They wouldn't be here making a mess out of Australia. But, as we learnt at the failed COP26 meeting in Glasgow, the world is on a greasy sled ride to accelerated unstoppable greenhouse effect. The politicians and the economists and the financiers are not interested in changing anything that matters. All they want to do is pretend that we are going to fix it one day in the future. They don't want to accept zero emissions. They want to talk about net zero emissions. That means we keep digging coal, we keep pumping gas, we keep burning fossil fuels now, and we expect someone in 8 or 9 years' time, or 20 or 30 years' time, to magically invent some counterfactual, non-existent technology that breaks all the laws of known physics and chemistry, and they're going to suck all of that carbon back down out of the sky so that fat cat trendy money grubbing assholes who want to be paid to do a job or to sit there and watch their share price index rise can be rich today. And anybody who fucking disagrees, like the people who are daily for weeks conducting protests around the port of Newcastle trying to stop the coal trains from carrying the fossil carbon to the port so Australia can export it, yeah, we lock those up. And the fucking pink pigs in blue suits think they're doing a good job for locking those people up. There is no correct response apart from refusing to participate in such a fucking charade. The economy is the problem, stupid. Kill the economy and the world will recover. continue to maintain the economy with growth at all costs, and the planet will die. Kill the economy, stupid. And stop trying to grow the fucking economy by attempting to grow the population on the most overpopulated continent on Earth when it comes to environmental sustainability versus population demands upon the environment. We don't look like Yemen and Somalia and Saudi Arabia yet, but that's just because those silly pricks have 5,000 or 6,000 years head start on us when it comes to environmental degradation. In terms of how much damage they did in the first 250 years after they took up the death cult of harvest everythingism, and how much fucking damage my ancestors did in the first 250 years of harvest everythingism being applied to Australia, we're doing a lot more damage a lot faster. So we're probably going to wind up in a worse place. Have a long, hard look at what the death cult of harvest everythingism has done to the planet, and then decide whether you want to clap and cheer next time a politician tells you they're going to grow the economy by pursuing non-existent technology like carbon capture and storage. And that if you disagree, they're going to lock you up because you're a naughty bad boy who's not doing what you're told. And in the meantime, 100 millimetres of rain in the last week, so everybody who got through the mouse plague and the drought and thought they were going to have a bumper harvest with their winter growing crops, nah, not at all. All their crops are fucking waterlogged, lying on the ground, starting to sprout, unharvestable, not worth anything. Wonder what they're going to tell the financiers who lent them the millions of dollars to put the crop in the ground to get them back up on their feet after the mouse plague and the drought and the heat waves. Suppose we could do with some hailstorms. Haven't had a good hailstorm for a while. Hope it doesn't come here. Still got holes in the bloody pool covers from the last hailstorm. It's an interesting job being the fool on the hill, trying to pay attention to all the silly shit that's going on, wrought by my fellow humans, the rest of the 8 billion, the people who don't want to accept the fact that we live on one single planet and we have to live within its ecological system limits. The dominant majority, the sheeples, they who must be obeyed. Warbles on a lot to YouTube. Such is life, fellas. Ciao.